June of 1944, a Louisiana shipbuilder helped break the back of the Axis powers when the Allies gained a logistical stronghold in occupied France. Andrew Jackson Higgins built the boats that brought victory to Europe in World War II.
Eisenhower told historian Stephen Ambrose that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us, which is an incredible statement. Now, Adolf Hitler also called Higgins the new Noah because of the boats that Higgins designed and developed.
Hitler and his generals had spent years fortifying the occupied European coastline with obstacles that included coast artillery emplacements in what became known as the Atlantic Wall. Deepwater ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre, or nearby Calais, were the most likely invasion points, and thus most heavily fortified, which is why the Allies didn't invade there. Instead, they knew that Andrew Higgins had designed a boat that made those ports unnecessary. All of Higgins' many boat designs had shallow drafts to float over hidden mines, and a nearly flat bottom that enabled them to sail right onto the beach. Certain boats had a ramp-like door in the front that allowed fast unloading of troops, jeeps, tanks, even small bulldozers.
Thanks to Higgins, whenever the Allies went to invade, they no longer had to sweep a harbor of mines. They no longer had to take an enemy-held port in order to land their assault troops.
The Higgins vote was of absolute crucial importance to the war-winning effort in World War II, mainly because of the fact that it gave the Allies an ability to transition troops and big ships in deep water across an open beach and to allow them to go into combat. This is an ability that prior to that was largely unheard of.
Higgins was an enterprising Louisiana timber importer who realized he could make more money converting his timber into boats, which he sold retail, than he could selling wood.
And he started making boats for the trappers and the oil field companies to allow them to go into the bayous, into the shallow waters that could navigate over sandbars, that could pull up on the side of a bank and retract without damaging the bow or the propeller.
When Higgins saw that the Navy was trying, without much luck, to develop a military landing craft throughout the 1930s, he thought he could sell them his Higgins boat design. At first, they weren't interested.
He was an Irishman who said he didn't wait for opportunity to knock. He'd kick the door down and drag the old harlot in. He told them that his boat was better. He told them in explicit words why their boats were inadequate. And he didn't mind telling the admirals face-to-face what he thought of it. The Navy disliked this. They saw him as the small, arrogant boat builder from the South. The Marine Corps saw him as a savior.
The Marines, the only service practicing landing operations in the late 1930s, realized that the Higgins boats did what Higgins said they could do. And since the Marines were the ones that were going to be landing in them, they forced the Navy to test them. Sure enough, the boats could ride right up onto the beach without doing any damage. The skag underneath the boat was built out like a housing, protecting the propeller and digging a channel in the sand when the boat rammed the beach. This also made retraction easier. Of special interest to the military was a feature adapted from a Japanese landing barge, the drop ramp front.
You could load 36 armed men standing in the upright position with packs on their backs and rifles in their hands, run that thing up onto the beach, drop the ramp, and in a matter of seconds, literally a matter of seconds, they could run off of that landing craft in the upright position and deploy into combat. It was recognized soon thereafter that having that ability was very useful to use in a tactical situation where a landing was being conducted under opposed circumstances, and in other words, landing troops under fire.
Higgins designed what became the Navy's LCP, or Landing Craft Personnel, for landing soldiers, LCVP, or Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, for landing soldiers and equipment, such as jeeps and small bulldozers, and LCM, or Landing Craft Mechanized, for unloading armored vehicles. In fact, Higgins designed more than 60 different landing craft. American mass production ensured there would be enough of them to overwhelm the enemy.
The United States was able to produce and equip practically all of our allies with landing craft throughout the war. Higgins Industries in New Orleans alone made 20,000 landing craft.
This was quite an order for a small boat builder, because the boats were built almost entirely out of wood, except for the metal ramp. Metal would have been too expensive and complicated to use. Higgins managed to acquire the last 3 shiploads of Philippine mahogany before the Japanese invaded the islands. Mahogany was used because it was a very strong hardwood. With the orders stacking up, Higgins created a larger factory. Meanwhile, he began assembling boats in the streets of New Orleans until the facilities were ready. With all the work that Higgins needed to accomplish for the war effort, he was able to employ a huge percentage of New Orleans' working population.
Having 20,000 people, he knew he needed every able-bodied person he could get, and race didn't matter to him. He hired people out of beauty parlors, he hired people who were chauffeurs, which didn't really sit well probably with the local community businesses. He was paying higher wages because he needed the people, and the employees loved Higgins. He wasn't just an industrialist figurehead. He knew the business from the wharf up, and they respected that in him.
So would the soldiers who took the Higgins boats into Normandy.
They used to call the ramp the gates to hell, because that was their only protection. Coming in, that metal ramp stopped the bullets.
And so for the men that were standing on the other side of that ramp, it had to have been absolutely horrifying to know that as soon as the ramp dropped, there would be nothing to stop those bullets entering the crew compartment.
The boats were designed for logistical support, not for enemy gunfire. The ramps on the LCVP were necessary to unload equipment, but when they dropped, soldiers on the boats were exposed. One of the most famous landings made by the Higgins boats was at Normandy, where they delivered men into some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war. Because of a rising tide and other conditions at Omaha Beach, coxswains were often unable to deliver soldiers onto the sand, instead unloading them into surf. Some men on these boats leapt overboard, only to encounter deeper water. Weighed down by their gear, many were drowned. But the vast majority of boats traveled close enough to the shore to unload. And once there, they made it impossible for the Allies to be dislodged.
We effect our landings on June 6th, and what continues for 3 months thereafter is providing sustaining logistical support to those armies fighting in Normandy. We had not captured Cherbourg. We had not captured Le Havre. In other words, we did not have a deep water port. And the only way that we kept a force of 250,000 supplied fighting in Normandy, the way that we kept the ammunition and the fresh water and the fuel and the extra socks supplied to our armies was by delivering them over the open beaches that had been captured on June 6th.
Though justly famous for their performance at Normandy, the Higgins landing craft proved valuable throughout the war, including over 115 landing operations in the Pacific Theater, also known as D-Day landings. They even proved useful after the war ended, long after Andrew Jackson Higgins died in 1952.
The same design was used in Korea. The same design initially was used in Vietnam. Now, if you think of what happened to the aircrafts, you went from the B-17s to the B-52s, but the little boat that carried the men and equipment stayed the same. It was such perfect design for what it was needed for that they really didn't have to change the design of that boat until they got to the hovercraft, the modern crafts, the Hellcats.
Today, nearly all of the original World War II Higgins boats have rotted away. At the National D-Day Museum in New Orleans, George Benedetto has built a Higgins boat LCVP to the exact specifications of the original blueprints.
We were able to find a few of the Higgins people who were still alive at that time that we got a fair amount of knowledge from. We have a fairly good set of plans, and there are some books out there. The framework of the boat probably has 4 times the normal skeleton internal frame structure that most typical boats have. When the boat is sitting at rest and not underway. Simply, the bottom cut for the door is above the water line. Actually, there's an incredible sealing system on it. It winches in tight to the hull, so even the water coming up is stopped from coming in.
The Allies got their money's worth from Higgins and his landing craft. His boats proved to be tactically and logistically irreplaceable during one of the most important invasions in human history. From their decks along the Normandy beaches, the Allies were able to launch a drive straight to Berlin and ultimately victory. Andrew Higgins sold his fast-moving boats to the Coast Guard during Prohibition to help stop rum runners. Later, Higgins claimed that he also sold his boats to the rum runners. Military Movers will return on Modern Marvels.